Okay, I think we're on the last section of Books and Islands. I'm going to read chapter 5 and the acknowledgments. This is, you can check out the playlist if you haven't been listening in for the other installments, but this is the fifth, I think the fifth, no, maybe the fourth installment of Books and Islands by Louise Erdrich. And it is a memoir of sort of a travel in the lakes and Ojibwe culture and Ojibwe language. And in this, the last chapter 4 that we were just in, they were visiting this island of Ernest Oberholzer, who was a canoeist, sort of an eccentric guy, a Harvard graduate who bought some islands and created these very idiosyncratic little cabins and libraries and sort of befriended the Ojibwe people. And so this remote island, which is now managed by a foundation, allows Ojibwe language speakers and people keeping the language alive to come onto the island, during the summer to do visits or whatever and visit the library. And so chapter 4 was talking about her visit to the islands and the library. And this final chapter chapter 5 is called Home. So I guess it's her going back to the Twin Cities. Telephone. We're going to make the drive straight down to the cities without stopping. So I keep Kitsikok, and that's her young 18-month-old daughter, awake throughout the last morning on the island until we are on the road. To keep her eyes open just a little longer, I break out a toy called Alpha Bug, who says, "Hey, that tickles," when she's turned on. Press the Alpha Bug's feet and she says a letter and can also make the sound of the letter. You can even get her to say whole words, though not suggestive or swear words. My older daughters have discovered that Alpha Bug won't even say the word sex. How do they do that? These toys made with sound chips did not exist when my children were young. Kitsikok happily presses green plastic bug feet until 20 miles south of International Falls when the letter D puts her to sleep. I have only been in sporadic phone contact with my daughters during this trip, which causes me great anxiety. I know they are fine. And as they are teenagers, they each have a life project they're embarked on. One is making a film in London, and one is studying in the Berkshires. One daughter is part of an international choir. Oddly, it has been easiest to talk to my daughter in London. I sat on a polished log chair at the one radio phone available on Ober's Island, and she stood in a phone booth just outside King's College using a phone card. We compared notes on food. She had found it best to frequent a Greek deli near the school instead of relying on cafeteria sandwiches made of mashed corn and chicken. I had found it best in Canada to rely on a trail mix, heavy on dried fruit, except, of course, for the memorable lunch at Kena Chiwanong and the food shared with Ojibwe food lovers on Ober's Island. Now, as I merge just past the Cloquet, Minnesota onto 35 South, heading to Minneapolis, the little cell phone I've taken silent all along makes a triumphant tootling sound at the end of its plug-in cord. I start dialing and I talk to my daughters from the road, check in with my household and with my bookstore people, with my sisters and parents, and all of a sudden, I am back in the web of connection. I am on the mainland, dry land, off of the islands, or so I think. Return. We arrive. We return. Home is familiar and it is disorienting. For days, I'm not quite here and not quite there. But I muddle around trying to enter the stream of my life. There is a sad discovery. The city forester has painted a blazing red ring in the letter A, sign of doom, around old Stalwart's trunk. This tree is older than the house, and I've carefully had it treated with a protective fungicide every few years to discourage death elm disease. The treatment doesn't always work. I knew that, but it's like a friend of mine is stricken. The tree is the classic fluted shape, and it raises immense and graceful arms high above our 3-story house. I love elm trees, grooved bark and sawtooth leaves and fluted silhouette. I think the earth has chosen to praise the sky by growing this tree. Even I can see the flags, the stunted and dead leaves, the ailing branches, the signs. And I stand outside with the tree in a state of helplessness. There should be a word specifically for the feeling one has about the death of a tree. I think of photographing old Stalwart, but I can't bear to. And within days, the city tree crew arrives and saws off those long, sweet limbs, lest the disease spread. And I'm so sad I cannot look at the tree anymore, and it hurts to see it maimed like that. A few more days pass, and then the forester seals off the street, notches the rest of the tree, and fells the street 3-story high stump onto the asphalt. I watch it go with Kizikok, and I feel the shock of its passage, a resounding shudder of the earth that tingles in our feet. That's it. It's gone. This has been a warm winter, and a second record number of elms have succumbed as the deep cold kills off the beetles and that spread the sickness. And as I am finishing this book, the city stump grinder arrives, and by the end of the day, his rotary blade has turned the rest of Old Stalwart into a pile of chips. It will be another 100 years if the house survives this long before a tree grown in its place tops the roof line and teases the sky. Reading distance. My happiness in being an older mother surprises me. Though often worn out, I don't seem to mind my sleepy days. I know they pass quickly. Some changes are permanent, though, for instance, my middle-aged vision. The first time I held Kitsakok in my arms just after she was born, I looked into her perfect face and realized I couldn't make out her features. I had to adjust her to my reading distance. It occurs to me now that I do this constantly. If reading is taken to mean comprehending, I step back often. I focus. To my great relief, I have a little more patience. And I've learned to appreciate as well as to fear the swift current of hours. Those first jagged months of ceaseless exhaustion pass like dreams. So quickly, I feel I've flown in and out of clouds. Already, she is making sense of things, and I am making sense of her. At the same time, my oldest daughters are soon leaving for college. All this year, I have found myself sorting through photographs as though to persuade myself that their childhoods had actually happened, that all of these years really occurred in fabulous particularity. Returning home after a long anticipated trip always does this to me. Time seems foreshadowed, furiously spent, a blur, as if Austerlitz says time is by far the most artificial of all of our inventions. Then what I am living in, what is this force that holds me captive in its ineluctable continuance? They still have Austerlitz to finish on my first night home. The book becomes a reassuring messenger from the near past, familiar now, a witness to my travels. Austerlitz doesn't wear a watch. I'm happy to read, considering one a thoroughly mendacious object. I don't wear a watch either, unless forced by circumstance. He explains what I have never completely thought about, my hope of somehow resisting time through these little forms of protest. Austerlitz hopes, he says, that time will not pass away, has not passed away, and that he can turn back and go behind it, and there find everything as it once was. And I suppose that is the point of sifting through my shoebox of photographs. Perhaps that is the point of everything, this writing most of all. There's a surprise memory for me at the end of Austerlitz, one that simultaneously revives a forgotten person, a teacher of mine, and gives me an unexpected metaphor to use in understanding where we have been. The last pages of the book are about another book, a memoir by Dan Jacobson, a writer whose father was a Lithuanian rabbi, died in 1920, and caused his wife to decide to emigrate with her 9 children to South Africa. They were the only people in his family who survived the Holocaust. Jacobson spent most of his childhood in the town of Kimberley, near the diamond mines, which were not fenced off, and to the edge of which children ventured to look down into a depth of several thousand feet. As Dan Jacobson was my advisor during what seemed like a very long term of study at University College London in 1976, I can almost see him describe how it was terrifying to see such emptiness open up a foot away from firm ground, to realize that there was no transition, only this dividing line, with ordinary life on one side and its unimaginable opposite on the other. The chasm into which no ray of light could penetrate, writes the narrator of Austerlitz, was Jacobson's image of the vanished past of his family and his people, which, as he knows, can never be brought up from those depths again. Dan Jacobson was a very kind man. I remember that we talked, perhaps to set me at ease, for I was shy, and he used to share chunks of the Cadbury bars he kept in his desk drawer, the kind in the purple wrapper studded with chunks of nuts and raisins. How odd it seems now that he is with me in Minneapolis and that I am nodding as I think, yes, it is though when I look past a generation or into the past of Tobosonoquet's world, there is a lightlessness too. For 9 of every 10 Native people perished of European disease, leaving only diminished and weakened people to encounter what came next. The aggressions of civilization, including government policies and missionaries and residential schools. Yes, here as I turn to Kitsikok, sprawled in sleep beside me is a light. Wood ticks. A pure little light, I think, reaching over to touch her curls. That is when I find the wood tick. It is still on the move, not attached, which is good, and I pluck it away and dispose of it and make certain there are no more. This one was probably carried in on a shirt or a blanket. And suddenly, of course, I itch all over. I don't know why they are so much worse than mosquitoes, for instance, but they are worse. Or maybe I just have a thing about them. Back on the island while eating lunch with Tobosonoquet, I plucked one off and made a shuddering noise. And he opened the top layer of his sandwich and said, "Throw him in." When I was a child and visited my grandparents in the Turtle Mountains, we cousins had a wood tick contest at the end of the day after playing in the woods. Any number under a 20 was scorned. And I remember one cousin winning one night with a grand total of 56. In the full blush of their season, I have seen them swarm around you off of willow branches, swarm slowly. That's what's so awful. Their tiny, blood-drawn, implacable lust. Up close, they are so small and neatly made. Of course, their true awfulness becomes apparent when they vampirize and grow big. Earlier in the summer, about a week after bringing our dog back from a trip up north, Kitsikok brought me a huge tick she'd found fallen off the dog. She held it solemnly, pinched between her fingers and thumb, first finger, her pinky crooked, its legs fine as copper hairs waving hopelessly. And I couldn't breathe for the horror of it. The thing looked like a grape. And later on, I described the moment to Pallas, who was dismissive. "Oh, Mom," she said, "Kitsikok's much too intelligent to eat anything with legs that move." Books. Why? I've been to islands and back. I've seen a great many books, and I've held in my hand several that would be set behind glass in the rare book rooms of the university libraries. I've touched the rock paintings, and I've read a fragment of their stories. Part of the trip is always the return, the way it shakes off of you, the washing of duffel bags of clothes, the tons of catalogs that have collected in the mailbox. The next day, tick-free, but sad over the tree and still disoriented. I walk over to our bookstore, Birch Bark Books in Minneapolis, and I started it with my daughters for idealistic reasons. The Native community, the neighborhood, the chance to work on something worthy with my girls. But really, in my deepest heart, I wonder now if I started it to cure myself of the affliction of books. The door is blue because I love blue. It is an old door rescued from the knockdown of some haute bourgeois Minneapolis house. It is beautiful. And the window boxes, which I planted with herbs and flowers, are overflowing now that it's August. And here is one of my favorite people in the world, Mr. Brian Baxter, who manages and oversees the getting and selling of the books at Birch Bark Books. Brian, who will read the barrel organ or maybe Mean Soup or maybe the Jungle Book out loud with perfect drama. Brian is also afflicted by books, but manages his addiction by having lived and sold books all his life and by keeping only a small portion, several thousand, of the books that have passed through his hands. Our store is pure comfort. Jelly beans, pretzels, and sour cherry bites are free. To create the store, we gutted a dentist's office and brought unpeeled birch trees to make a loft and birch boards to make floor-to-ceiling shelves. The store has good acoustics, and we play our favorites in contemporary Native music, from Black Lodge to Carlos Nakai's native flute, and of course, Primo and Mike's peyote songs, perfect for reading and browsing. This bookstore looks like the inside of a cabin on Ober's Island. There's an old Catholic confessional against one wall, bought from a salvage company. There are easy chairs that I plucked from neighborhood alley dumpsters or boulevards where they've been left for the taking, and I've had them upholstered in soft denim. I was delighted to walk in one morning to find a writer I much admire sitting in one of those chairs and frowning at the corrections on a final proof of his new book. I am often thrilled when I can sit in the bookstore audience and listen to Susan Power or Jim Northrup read from their work. Writers sign our back wall. Our bathroom is papered with poems. Our office is the former dentist's closet where he prepared fillings and kept dank lunches in a stuttering 2-foot refrigerator. And now the office closet is loaded with books and book orders and too many bills to pay, for there is always that, the costliness of any great love. There's sage, there's sweetgrass, there's red paint. This little bookstore is where I belong and where anyone can belong. It is a home for people who love books and a place that cannot be duplicated by any bookstore corporation. It is just too personal. It is an island as lovingly in itself as any lake. It is our store. The greedy melancholy that Ober's books inspired falls away. It is an excellent and cheering thing to have a flow of books around you, to see them as they enter and then they take the money from people's hands as they disappear. They must be sold, taken away. And still, besides my daily visit, sometimes I come to the store at night, and I love to be among books and to fuss them into a pleasant order, just the way I love moving plants around in my garden. One of our booksellers watching me says, "Oh, you've come to love the books again." Being around books is only about half actual reading after all. The other part is talking about books with other people, a rich topic, and yet is another enjoying the presence. And sitting in the bookstore half light, I feel great contentment. Birch Bark Books is just off Lake of the Isles. I didn't even think about this before I left, but that's it. The whole thing about islands and books. There really are 2 islands on Lake of Isles, and they are both wild islands, little places in the city where from a canoe I've seen great horned owls, black-crowned night herons, Arctic tern, dozens of black or painted turtles swirling off logs, and once a bald eagle. And maybe I live among the books and islands, and also I must visit them in more remote places because I've decided in some deeply interior way unavailable to my conscious mind until I've started writing this book that I will order my life to deal with an hoary old cliche. This cliche has truly nagged at me. It is the question that I've asked myself periodically ever since. I was 9 years old, and the question is, what book would you take to a desert island? I even have the question taped up on the top of a cigar box on the bookstore counter, a request to customers to write their favorites on slips of paper, a way to find out about their tastes and discover their titles and what was overlooked. And what book would you take to a desert island? What a dismal thought, to have only one book to read over and over for years and years, to think of the miserable moment in the movie Castaway when poor Tom Hanks opens the FedEx box to find a video cassette. If only it had been a book. But which book should it have been? Well, my solution is a dictionary. A dictionary would last and last. A dictionary would be a good thing to have arrived in that FedEx box. But even better, to be like Oberholzer and store up 11,000, or be an Ojibwe raised on stories and to contain many books in mind. Or me with a bookstore. Why books? I guess that's the picture of like books and stuff. Okay, so I'm going to read the acknowledgments at the end. Another journey. The islands and the books still call us every summer. In June 2013, we set out in a newer version of the van, a 2005 Honda Odyssey, similarly packed to the gills, and it is an innocuous silver gray like most cars. One of my daughters called it the manatee. I call it the Ark. Inside, there is my daughter, Asa, the artist commissioned to make the cover of this book, Keys, who is now 12, and me. And there's also Rhodey, the traveling dog, who was born the same year as Kiz. And Rhodey has a maniacal devotion to my oldest daughter, Persia, but tolerates me. Rhodey is recovering from surgery to her neck. A little white Jack Russell, she looks like a repaired stuffed animal with neat black stitches attaching her head to her muscular body. The other dog, Ryoga, has his own story, named for the black pig of Asa's favorite childhood anime series, Ranma Half. This dog is a very graceful wisp of charcoal. Rhodey is outraged by his playful sorties. She glares in reproach from her tiny pink bed at the passenger's feet. The many toys Kiz has on the previous trip have been replaced by electronic devices, iPhone, laptop, iPad, and so on. And after the 49th parallel, there's no reception. So I let her glut herself with screens for the first few hours. Anyway, we are visiting Persia on the way up north. Ojibwe Moda Dida. Ojibwe Moda Dida. To my dear surprise, Persia has become the Ojibwe language leader in the family. For the past 4 years, she has been doing all she can to become fluent. This is her third summer as a coordinator of an immersion Ojibwe language program held at the Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College. And for 3 weeks in the summer and one weekend a month during the school year, absolutely no English is spoken here. Cell phones and the above-mentioned devices are confiscated upon entry. And when I visited the program for a weekend last winter, I excitedly opened my mouth to speak and found a well of nothingness. And after 2 hours of stilted trying, I went into my room and I fell into a dead sleep, and my brain had saturated. That's how the whole weekend went. A few hours of Ojibwe and then a dead sleep as my brain cells absorbed conjugations. It's very difficult. People struggle, they cry, but they begin to speak, and Persia loves her work. She gets an evening off to check in with us and similarly falls into a deep sleep in the motel room, clutching Rhodey. We plot the rest of our travels. The next morning, we are off. First, we go to Canada, but here things take an odd turn. And while there, we inadvertently, grudgingly add a baby grackle to the ark. Beneshina Island. Beneshina Island. Okay. This island in Lake of the Woods has innumerable birdhouses and is like the predator-free zones in New Zealand, only for birds. There are no feral cats because the eagles get them. There are no squirrels because the vigilant owner and keeper of the island relocates them to squirrel heaven. Beneshina means bird, and only birds are allowed. Mergansers, mallards, buffleheads, arctic terns, goldfinches, purple finches, black and white warblers of many other varieties, rose-breasted and evening grosbeaks, ruby-throated hummingbirds, white-throated sparrows, grouse, blue jays, loons, and grackles. Why books? Why grackles? It is here that we find a fledgling with a broken wing. Asa climbs a ladder and puts him back into the tree close to his nest, and we think the parents who are still taking care of the other nestlings might feed him. But although for an entire afternoon, the baby grackle emits a hoarse grack, as persistent and irritating as the low battery signal on a smoke alarm, his parents swish around, ignoring him. They have left him to die, Kisa says. Oh God, I think. Nature is harsh. But please don't let me rescue him, because the common grackle is a greedy, opportunistic, feckless, fearless, cold-eyed, only slightly glorified lizard of a bird. And yet, what would Kisa do? Of course, as the night comes on, the grack continues, and I climb the ladder and scoop up the bird. We bring it in. We show the girls how to feed it. And when the mouth opens, we push a tiny gob of soft dog food down the gullet with the eraser end of a pencil. That's how I've saved crows. Drugged with protein, the nestling drops off. Next morning, the bird is focused. More food every few hours. We teach him to drink from a cup. His wing still drags, but he couldn't care less. He's growing right before our eyes. We daub an antibiotic cream on his wound. I contemplate getting him drunk on a few tablespoons of wine and sewing his wing together. I think my operation might kill him, but I also have a sense that not so much can kill a grackle. He's a dystopic sort of bird. Grackles will make it through climate change and every other sort of catastrophe humans throw at wildlife. And so he gets his name. Tenacious G. To get back down to Ober Island, we now have to smuggle a grackle over the Canadian border. We put him in a cardboard grackle box covered with a Costco bag, and he has emptied Ryoga's seat. And when hungry back there, he gracks. And if he gracks at the border crossing, Kisa plans to pretend I have lost her cell phone. But as I do at all border crossings now, I ask my daughter to take the wheel. No border guard ever troubles Asa with her splendid eyes and radiant smile. We have the correct papers for the dogs and a bandana around Rhodey's neck so nobody can see her head is sewed on. The young guard gives us a cursory check and wishes Asa a very good day, and we drive to Rainy River. We are meeting two friends who were married on this island last year. They have a granddaughter, Sequoia, nearly Kiz's age. We don't travel lightly, but when Beth Waterhouse, executive director and wise woman of the island, shows up with a sturdy gear-toting vessel, she takes us in stride. She doesn't even raise an eyebrow at Tenacious. And from the first step onto the island, it is obvious that this place has made the right friends. 10 years have made it even better because of the hardworking volunteers. The gardens are cheerful and immaculate, a huge bed of scarlet poppies in full fancy skirted bloom, Ober's house, and the extraordinary fireplace that houses the spirit of a man, Charlie, Friday, Gewewo Sedang, has been lovingly repaired. And there's a fancy new Swedish bathroom with framed doggerel and a gate made of a swinging paddle. and each book in the collection has been cataloged, cleaned, repaired, and replaced where Ober left it. The scent of old paper and cedar fills the rooms of each house. The bookcases, some ingeniously hanging from the rafters, have been invisibly reinforced. The scale of the commitment to Ermias Oberholzer's legacy, the intensity of thought that goes into each invisible improvement on his island, the forthright love, and the welcome. God, it is all so moving that my eyes tear up, and I put the grackle on my shoulder to remind me that the world is hard. Grack. We are at home here. Aza chooses her spot in the artist cabin close to the water, simple with wooden hooks for her clothing and dappled light. And there, over the coming weeks, she works and reworks the art piece that becomes the cover of this book. Okay. Asabikeshinyag. The name in Ojibwe has to do with making nets. No surprise. The surprise is how big they are and how suddenly they appear. A wolf spider hunts in bounds across Aza's cream-colored wall at night. The giant water spiders that bask on the rocks near the bathing pools at Ober's are mottled like the stones and motionless. Aza nearly puts her hand on one. The most amazing spider moment on the island occurs for me on the loading dock, where I find 6 or more Halloweeny-looking black, white, orange, muscular fellows, a WWF-size spider gang soaking up the heat. They don't like the vibrations of my footsteps, and they stand up on tiptoe, swivel their faceted eyes at me, and I stop. And they relax and start goofing around again. One spider grabs another by the arm and slings his pal off the dock into the water. Too much! I jump. They disappear. We are here to work on the language, and Kiz and Sequoia decide to catalog and draw the spiders, turtles, mosquitoes, deer flies, frogs, and fish that surround us, all in Ojibwe. And they work on the pictures and words, and I translate the Star Trek Book of Opposites. My friend, the writer, Gail Caldwell, has a phrase in her book, New Life, no instructions. Slower than the speed of light. That's my Ojibwe language learning, but I'm still at it, and I'm still trying. Same with our little independent, whose picture I end with, birch bark books. The little store has not only survived, but is beginning to float by itself. Mysterious, I am up north getting ready to go home, tend the bookstore, and bring the grackle back down to be cured at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in St. Paul when we hear about the tree. Of the great elm trees around my house, described in the book, only one is left, the guardian of the West, a biting elm. The black locust, haywire, and entire trust have grown high enough to fill my 3rd-story windows. There are hornbeam and white pines, a couple of maples to name, a catalpa that had its origins in my mother's flower pot. I think a lot about the trees around my home. And up north, my cell phone suddenly fills with calls. I talk with Persia, and she tells me what has happened, very tenderly, because she knows that this tree is special. Abiding was a boulevard elm planted by the city when my house was built. Abiding was felled with 3,500 trees in Minneapolis by the straight winds of a ferocious storm following weeks of rain. These conditions toppled the trees with the biggest canopies, for with the soaking rains, their roots lost purchase. It was an extremely beautiful elm of the classic wine glass shape, and one by one, the other elms succumbed to Dutch elm in spite of their years of inoculation. Abiding stood alone, which made her more vulnerable. Fallen, she fills the backyard and makes it a jungle, impassable. And with most of the power gone in Minneapolis, Persia has driven home from Fond du Lac to an apocalyptic scenario with people in line and the liquor store buying booze with cash and trees down everywhere blocking streets. And she makes it home only to find a camera crew at the smashed gate. It is now 4 months since Abiding fell, and as I write this, the city is just now removing her 108-year-old stump. The crane claw worries, digs, and finally drags the stump out of the earth like a great tooth. And then I see why Abiding fell in the only place that would miss our house. Beneath the earth, a mirror tree existed, the roots thick as the old branches flowing toward the watery sand of the yard, away from the sterile dangers of the street. Northern Lights. Lastly, this. Traditional Ojibwe people do not speak the names of those who have gone to the spirit world. Elders often shrug, hum, or look away when those names come into conversation. After a generation, those names can be given to a close family member. That keeps the name alive, and it is said that the person securely in the spirit world, visibly dancing in the northern lights, is very happy to hear their name spoken by the living. But not using the names of the dead when referring to them, at least for some time, makes sense to me. It is a way of dealing with sorrow over the grievous loss of someone you love. I wasn't raised that way, but it makes sense. It is not, as some say, because you are calling their spirit back. It is not, as some say, because the spirit might grow troubled and return. I think it is because not speaking the person's name keeps their spirit closer. It is somehow comforting not to speak of the person by name, but just to think of him leaping on rocks, scowling in his piercing way as he concentrates, smiling in delight or kindness, laughing in surprise, carrying his child on his shoulders. Me, you. And let's see, this is just one more acknowledgement. To the Ojibwe speakers and language experts, I tried my best to get it right and went over the book in 2002 with Basona Kutaban. And he told me the words that describe shades of feeling, and I spelled them as I heard them. And the Ojibwe is a mixture of Canadian and Southern dialects, and any mistakes are mine. The names of plants are found in Plants Used by the Great Lakes Ojibwe by James E. Meeker, John E. Elias, John A. Heim, published by the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Commission. The words for computer and rhinoceros were given to me by Nawigiziban Jim Clark. Again, I spelled them as I heard them, and I included them because they are delightful. And I would like to thank everyone mentioned in these pages. Miigwech. About the author. Louise Erdrich is a native of North Dakota, where she was raised by her Ojibwe French mother and German-American father. She is the author of 14 novels, as well as volumes of poetry, short stories, children's books, and a memoir of early motherhood. Her novel, The Roundhouse, won the National Book Award, and The Plague of Doves was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and won the Ainsfield Wolf Book Award. Her novel, Love Medicine, won the National Book Critics Circle Award. Louise Erdrich lives in Minnesota and is the owner of Birch Bark Books, an independent bookstore. And so that is the end. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm going to probably put a little comment with a link to American Horse, which is a much more touching short story about Indigenous people and social welfare systems and the predation of that, because I think that's really relevant to some of the stuff that we're dealing with in my research. Thanks, everybody. Bye.